I'm excited to introduce our next plenary speaker, Nicole Pittman. Nicole Pittman is the Executive Director of Just Beginnings Collaborative. She believes true child sexual abuse prevention begins with unraveling one-size-fits-all responses, while examining root causes and amplifying the community strengths. Please join me in welcoming Nicole to the stage.
The author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, is known for her groundbreaking talks, books, and other forms of literature on a number of thought-provoking topics. The Danger of a Single Story is one of her memorable TED Talks she gave in 2009. In her talk, Adichie tells the story of how she found her authentic cultural voice as a strong Nigerian-born feminist, and warns that if we hear only a single story, the one perspective, it can lead us to default assumptions, conclusions, and decisions that may be incomplete and may lead to misunderstanding. She mentions the way people in other continents have a single story of Africa, one of catastrophe. Adichie also talks about coming to college in the US and finding herself on the receiving end of a single story. She says, "I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. I left Nigeria to go to the university in the US. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked me where did I learn to speak English so well. I was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called tribal music, and she was really disappointed when I produced my mixtape of Mariah Carey. What struck Adichie was that her roommate had felt sorry for her even before seeing her. Adichie stated that the default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. Like many of you, I have a single story as well. I started off, or I still am, a very rambunctious person with a lot of energy, and my mom and dad put me into sports. And I ran track, played tennis at the end of high school, where that's what I focused on. I went to Duke University and ran track. My coach assumed because I was black that I was a sprinter. Not at all. I was frustrated. I felt unseen when he put me in the sprints, which is the 100 meter, 200 meters. I loved running, but the 100 meters is only 1/4 of the track. I was used to running 4 laps around the track. I pleaded with my coach to change my event. He said, "You need to become a racehorse, an assassin. Stop thinking so much." While I knew I was more competitive than my classmates and friends, but a racehorse, an assassin? In her TED Talk, Adichie says stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. My coach ignored the fact that I went running on off days for 5 miles in the hills. I was also a strategist by nature. I enjoyed running in a track race behind the pack for the first 2 laps, and then slowly making my way to the front for that last 3rd and 4th lap. Upon reflection, I probably didn't advocate well for myself. That might have been a symptom of being a child sexual abuse survivor. But oh well. The racehorse and assassin mentality were contrary to my true self. Eventually, my coach looked past the single story, or maybe he had no choice, when I kept coming up in races against one single person who went to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I don't know if dating myself, but I don't know if people have heard of Marion Jones, who became the fastest woman in the world, very slowly. In her TED Talk, Adichie believes that stories matter, but that all too often we operate from the perspective of only knowing a single story about a person, a situation, or perhaps a conflict. The risk of the single story, that one perspective, is that it can lead us to default assumptions, conclusions, and decisions that are incomplete, and it may lead to misunderstanding. Operating from the context of a single story can prevent us from a more complex, nuanced view of the situation. Let's keep that in mind as we start to delve into what it means to realize true prevention of child sexual abuse. When it comes to child sexual abuse, our shared long-term vision is a just world, a society made up of communities, relationships, and individuals that are liberated from the cycles of violence that we see today. To transform our society, we must be able to imagine the future that we want. Meaningful change is only possible when we are willing to face and take action to address the gaps between the future we long for and the realities we are living. Our reality right now is that there is no way that we are going to end or prevent child sexual abuse in our current system. What we are doing is not prevention. The reality is that preventing child sexual abuse is not a matter of reforming a system that works poorly or even replacing a system that is addressing the issue. There's never been a system in this system for preventing child sexual abuse. Our current system is not set up to prevent. What we think of and call prevention in our society does not actually stop child sexual abuse from happening. Rather, it is a series of after-the-fact responses and reactions, such as mandatory reporting, education programs in school which are focused on teaching children to report forbidden acts, offender management, diversion programs for those who have already harmed, and extraction punishment meted out by the criminal justice system, which overshadows real solutions. When we look at the options that we have and our communities have to respond to violence, we see a painfully narrow set of choices or a single story. If we continue doing what we've always done, we will only be able to respond to incidents of child sexual abuse after they happen. So how do we realize true child sexual abuse prevention? I'm going to lead you through a few scenarios of what is now and what could be. Number one, what is? In our current system, we primarily manage child sexual abuse by responding to individual harm through a single story once it happens. Our attention on the monsters in our midst feeds an attachment to the mistaken belief that sexual harm is locatable in an individual or bad people, that it is fixable by criminal law, and in short, that justice and repair can be measured by the number of years one is sentenced to live behind bars. There's a statistic that RAINN has on its site. It says every 92 seconds an American is sexually assaulted, and every 9 minutes that victim is a child. Meanwhile, only 5 out of every 1,000 perpetrators will end up in prison. That's the sign for people to give money, to keep giving money to lock people up. This story leaves us with little hope for preventing child sexual abuse or responding to incidences when they occur, and certainly without options for transforming our conditions to ensure that children are never sexually abused. What could be? What if we could focus on the conditions or the moments before child sexual abuse happens? What if there was a community process that creates responses to violence that do what our current system fails to do, which is intervene in ways that support the person who experienced sexual abuse, to heal from the impacts, and to respond in a way that allows and requires the person who sexually abused a child to take accountability and to truly transform their behavior. And it allowed families and communities to see all the choices and circumstances, big and small, that allowed this harm to occur, and how things can be changed so this harm is less likely to happen again. What is? Miriam Kaba asserts many survivors report that they do not want to involve the police or courts in their lives. They simply want the violence to end. This is not unusual. Fewer than half of the people who are victims of crime have ever called the police. Most people prefer nothing as opposed to the current criminal punishment system. That's a real indictment on our current system. What could be? What could be? What if a single survivor coming forward to tell their tale of harm years ago would actually have been believed the first time? What if we could immediately focus on addressing the harms perpetrated, centering on the concerns and experiences of the person who was harmed? And communities could build collective support for survivors, which show that no survivor will be left alone. And that violence is a shared problem that impacts everyone. What if a neighbor told a survivor that they are powerful sources of knowledge and change rather than being seen as powerless victims in need of protection by a judge? What is? Policing, the criminal justice system, and child welfare system were built from a design intended to punish, separate, and criminalize, not prevent, transform, or heal. They are also inherently violent, having been built upon the legacies of slavery, genocide of indigenous folks, misogyny, xenophobia, ableism, and the oppression of human beings. Social justice lawyer and author of the book Just Mercy, Bryan Stevenson, said, "The big problem we have in the US is that we don't actually know our history. We don't know about the centuries of racial injustice." Bryan Stevenson gave a lecture in Germany, and someone said to him, "We can never have the death penalty in Germany. There's no way with our history that we can engage in the systematic execution of human beings. It would be unconscionable. Imagine if in Germany today there was a death row and that Jewish people were systematically more likely to be convicted. And yet in this country, the evidence of racial disparities in our justice system is well documented." Stevenson's comparison to our racial history to that of the Holocaust in Germany was incredibly powerful. The idea that if we reckon with our history and acknowledge our history of enslavement of Black people, it will allow us to actually become a free, just, equitable society. Until we understand that our modern day system of policing, which includes criminal justice and child welfare, can be traced back to the slave patrol, which was created in the early 1700s with one mission: to establish a system of terror and squash slave uprisings with the capacity to pursue, apprehend, kill, and return runaway slaves to their owner. Until we reckon with that, you can't begin thinking about, well, what are our responsibilities now? What are our obligations now? What would it take to recover from this violence? It begins with honesty. If you've done something wrong to someone else and genuinely don't know what you've done wrong, you're not going to be able to fully reconcile with that person. You're not going to be able to adequately apologize. You're not going to be able to say the things you need to say for a path forward towards recovery. We have to reckon and make peace with the country's history. To do so will allow us to move past that single story that prevents us from a more complex, nuanced view of the situation. That's a system designed to capture slaves cannot be places of safety, support, and healing. And what could be? While some of us ask, how will we be safe from sexual violence without police and prisons? If we fully understand this history of our system, we will start to point out that we can't be safe as long as this system exists. To realize true child sexual abuse prevention, we must transform those conditions and the harm that they cause. We must liberate our imaginations, listen deeply to the children and communities least served by systems, and invest in people and relationships. The good news is that this is already happening. Every single one of the what could be's that I mentioned are already happening. Community-based responses and interventions to violence that do not rely on the state are happening. Responses to violence that do not create more violence and harm are happening. Things that actively cultivate healing, accountability, and resilience for all, including the survivor, including the person that's done harm and having them take accountability and truly transform their behavior, are happening. We're skilling up families and communities and changing the context so that harm is less likely to happen. It's happening. These are also the underlying principles of transformative justice. Transformative justice is an overarching framework that includes specific ideologies, values, strategies, practices, which has at its core the idea that we can't end violence with more violence. Transformative justice seeks to prevent, intervene in and transform harm and violence through non-punitive accountability. As such, transformative justice embodies and promotes an abolitionist politic that demands that we end prisons, policing, surveillance, which are inherently violent. It addresses the roots of violence and uproots oppression to create a just society. It's a framework that prioritizes relationship building, developing our skills, building new structures, and actively working to uproot oppressions. So, what does this mean? This doesn't mean that you can go to the government or go to the president's house and say we need money to become an abolitionist or transformative justice organization. It's not going to happen. What we can do is we can put things into practice. Putting into practice requires ongoing effort and reflection. We need to support each other to figure out how to do things differently, to build the world we want. This does not mean that we shouldn't challenge harmful behaviors or hold people accountable. It means that we need to respond with strategies that move beyond the single story and are not about escalating harm through isolation or individual punishment. In her TED Talk on the danger of the single story, Adichie tells us that stories are personal, but the problem is political. Single stories about people, places, situations are tools by which those with power control how we understand and interact with those without. Adichie says it's impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. How they are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told are really dependent on power. So let's start thinking about in your everyday practices how the single story shows up in your work. For example, I met with, a few years ago, medical doctors in the ER that were treating children that were coming in for sexual abuse or abuse. And they stated that the medical practice in the ER allows treating physicians to assume abuse and report it if information is not available. And that includes if the parent is incoherent or speaks a different language. What are single stories that we have to follow in order to pull a child out of our home, out of the arms of a parent? To start our journey toward true prevention of child sexual abuse, we must resist our proclivity to create a single story and address everyone involved in a child's life. We must shift the cultural norms and behaviors, actions and feelings, beliefs, hearts and minds of all of us who knowingly or unknowingly allow child sexual abuse to occur. Thank you.